Ladies and gentlemen, it's so wonderful to have you here because we have something to talk about. On behalf of the research entity appointeda at the Northwest University, we want to welcome you to this book launch. And we're talking about the book Community Psychology. It's the second edition of the book, Global Crisis, Local Realities and Action. And already in the subtitle, you'll see a bit of a change in the second edition. We have a whole range of experts here, including the editors of the book, to talk about the book and to focus on what it actually entails. We have a wonderful discussion lined up. People from all over the world who will be contributing to our discussion. And you can as well. If you signed in to YouTube, you can post your question and we'll see it. We'll pose it to our panel of experts and engage on the themes that you'd like to raise. So feel free to provide those comments, provide those questions. We'd love to hear from you. Do so in the chat section of YouTube, and we'll get back to you regarding your question. As I said, a wonderful book. I have so many things to say about the book, so many questions from myself. I've had a look at all the different chapters and the topics addressed in those chapters. They are beautiful. The different themes addressed in the book as well. I want to jump into it, but I'm going to hold myself back and get the editors and the professors and so on to talk about the book. I'm very fortunate to have the three editors of the book here right next to me, and we're going to hear from them. They are Norman Duncan, Vera, Roos, and Jace Pillay, all professors, all esteemed as editors of this book, but also as academics, as psychologists, as practitioners. They know what they're talking about. I'd like to introduce them to you. We have Professor Norman Duncan here. Now, Professor Norman, he's sitting here to my right. He interchanges between different roles as a professor, either an emeritus professor, University of Pretoria, an extraordinary professor at the Northwest University, and then I think a visiting professor. That sounds like a nice one. You know, you just pop in whenever you want to at Nelson Mandela University. He focuses on racism and community psychology, former president of the Psychological Society of South Africa. We have his successor also here, past editor-in-chief of the South African Journal of Psychology. I'm going to give him the opportunity to speak in just a moment. Let me also welcome Prof Jace Pillay. Now, he's the new president. I'll have to classify that as well, the new president of the Psychological Society of South Africa. He started in October, and as today is the 2nd of October, he is fresh in that position. He holds a research chair in education and care and childhood at the University of Johannesburg. From 2024, the UNESCO Chair in mental health for teachers and learners. He's a registered psychologist. His work focuses on mental health and psychosocial support in schools. And he's here today. Prof Pillay, wonderful to have you here as well. He's sitting to my far right. And then, I tell you, if you haven't had a conversation with Prof Vera Roos, you must schedule it now. A wonderful person to engage with, a professor in the agenda program at the Northwest University in appointeda, an affiliate research fellow at the University of Oxford, a socio-gerontologist, and that's the thing that you must talk to her about. Wonderful. She studies intergenerational relationships and developed Jabelana, I think that's how you pronounce it, an e-directory for older persons. Published widely, 4 edited books, and we're here to talk about this book, of which he is a co-editor. Professors, it's wonderful to have you here. Let's jump to it and make sure that we start discussing this wonderful second edition of your book. We're going to start with Prof. Norman Duncan. Professor, it's wonderful to have you here. Let's get things going.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the welcome. Good morning to the audience here in the room as well as those online. You know, Vera and Jace, it's something that just occurred to me. Jace and I had a conversation about the last times we were on this campus. I realized that the last time I was here was in 2005, and it was to discuss the development of the textbook titled Community Psychology Analysis, Context and Action, so the precursor to this book. So we've come full circle. I'm here again, and this time to launch a new book in the same field. Colleagues, perhaps I can share with you how we had decided to write an updated version, a radically transformed version of the book that was published in 2007. About 3 years ago, we were approached by Juta with the conundrum that currently the precursor to this book, Community Psychology Analysis, Context and Action, was still being used quite widely at South African universities, and that made us feel a bit uncomfortable because a number of the, quite a bit of the content of that book had become dated. I mean, the world today is dramatically different to the world, to what the world had been in 2005, 2006, 2007. And of course, the discipline of community psychology itself had changed dramatically since 2000. And let me just change the slides here. Looks like
we're just checking. Let's just move on,
okay,
on our slide here.
Okay.
Right,
In any case, let me speak to the content of the slide. Like I said, the world had changed dramatically since 2007. Currently, I mean, if we look at the conditions prevailing throughout the world, I mean, the levels of uncertainty, poverty, warfare, is very different to what had pertained in 2007. So obviously, and all these major instabilities and events throughout the world obviously have an impact on communities. They have a profound impact on communities. So the communities that we address in the community psychology book of 2007 were very different to the communities that we need to address in contemporary society. So that was one of the reasons why we had decided to go on to rework that initial book and to come up with another volume. I'll speak very briefly about how this volume differs from the preceding volume. The other important fact that one obviously also has to bear in mind is that the discipline of community psychology had also changed dramatically or fundamentally over the past 20 years. It's got new concerns, new priorities. I suppose one of the key priorities at this point in time would be the importance of us addressing issues of decolonization as fundamental also to the work of community psychology. Other things have changed how we teach, and that too would have an impact on what we include in the book. Now I'm going to speak very briefly to the structure of the book, and then I want to go over to the thanks and acknowledgements because I need to leave enough time for Vera and Jace. In terms of the structure of the book, when you get a copy of the book, you'll see that the book is divided into four substantive sections. In fact, it's 3 substantive sections and an introduction. So section 1 is the introduction, section 2 is the histories of community psychology, and there are multiple histories of community psychology. To us, it's particularly important to look at the history of community psychology in South Africa, and that is ably dealt with by one of our contributors, namely Garth Stevens. And Jeffrey Yen also contributes significantly to understanding of the evolution of community psychology and the history of community psychology. And then in section 3, we look at salient contemporary issues that community psychology has to engage with if it wants to play a meaningful role, I suppose, in the health sciences, the mental health sciences, and the social sciences. Some of the issues we deal with are, and one of our presenters today will speak to that, will be issues of surrounding the climate emergency or the climate crisis that the world is facing, gendered poverty, and so forth. And then the last section, I'm sure that Jace will elaborate on that because that's an area that is of key interest to him, and is an area in which he has enormous expertise and knowledge, is the area dealing with teaching, learning, research, and other interventions in community psychology. Colleagues, now the most important part of my role here today, because I mean, we've come a long way. This has been a very hugely edifying process for myself. It's been an enriching process for myself, working with colleagues whom I've had a working relationship with for, and I won't say the number of decades, I don't want to date or age anyone, but we've known each other for a long while, and we've collaborated with each other on several projects. So it's been an absolute joy to work with them once again, particularly at an intellectual level. Obviously, we're good friends, so it's good to engage with one another at a social level, but intellectually, it's very important for us to test our ideas against each other, and that had certainly happened during the course of writing of this book. The other important value that the book had for me is because my last key portfolio in academia before I retired was that of being the vice principal academic at the University of Pretoria. And one of the key aspects of that portfolio was to manage teaching and learning. And so when we did this book, though this book is driven by research, that was one lens I kept on, I suppose, focusing on, one aspect I kept on focusing on. And for that reason that I had made quite a strong case for us to include the notion of global online learning in this book. We can also, I mean, we prioritize global online research as well. We have to make use of the affordances of technology, I suppose, to grow our discipline, but also to educate our students as well as for researchers to collaborate across boundaries, across borders, across national divides. Now, the most important part of my input is to, and I know that you know who had contributed to this book, but it's important that I mention them by name. I want to express my thanks and my gratitude and acknowledgement to these individual authors, and I'm sure that Vera and Jace will support me in this. It's going to take us a minute or two, but I do need to go through this as an important aspect of the whole community psychology of writing endeavor, or the whole process of writing this community psychology book. The first person I'm doing this alphabetically is Rashid Ahmed. Brendan Barnes will speak momentarily. Tuchida Basadin, Brett Bowman, who had been a key contributor to both volumes. Tembelishle Dube Ade, Janice Frank, Tanya Graham, Jaco Hoffman, Salome Imanfurgo, Malosi Langa, Sishle Mamutse, and Kateko Matebula, Boikutso Maubane Moicheki, Tokomai Kiso, Anthony Naidu. Then to Lesego Plank, Puleng Sagalo, Odwa Reke, Gar Stevens, Christy van der Westhuizen, Ashley van die Kerk, and Jeffrey Yen. And then, of course, we have to acknowledge and thank the reviewers, all the reviewers who had reviewed the chapters independently, as well as the reviewers who had looked at the volume in its globality, who had looked at the volume globally. And then, of course, it's important for me to single out one person who had been key to this entire process, and that was Richard van Rensburg, who was the project manager of sorts. I mean, he kept us all together, kept us on track, reminded us of deadlines, managed the data for us, the information, and ensured that this whole process, I think, unfolded very, very smoothly. And then, of course, we need to acknowledge and thank Professor Myrna Nell, the Deputy Dean Research and Innovation here at Northwest University, and also a member of appointeda. Then, too, I need to thank the School of Human and Community Development of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of the Witwatersrand. And the last two people, or the last two entities, Prof Myrna Nell, as well as the School of Human and Community Development, I need to thank them specifically for the large the significant funding they had awarded to ensure that this project could unfold without too many obstacles and too many difficulties. And then, of course, I need to thank my co-editors, co-editors and significant contributions to the volume, Professors Jace Pillay and Vera Roos. Colleagues, thank you so much for your enormous investment in this initiative, which I believe is a very important initiative and I hope will bear fruit in the years to come. And then lastly, of course, the publisher, Jutta, and specifically Lynn Koch for the critical role that she has played, as well as the design team and the technical team at Jutta. Of course, I'm very, very impressed with the book itself, the cover of the book. We'd given them a rough idea of what we wanted it to be similar to the previous book, but substantively different as well. And they came up with this marvelous design, and I really think it does justice to the hard work that the contributors had invested in this project. There's much more that I can say. I promise I was only going to speak for 5 minutes, but I said that academics don't know when to end. My apologies, colleague.
Prof Duncan, thank you so much. As you've heard, ladies and gentlemen, he gave us a taste, a bit of an intrigue, a bit of a perspective into what the book entails, and I can't wait to hear more about the content of the book as well. I'll tell you more about the book and specifically where you can obtain it, which website you must visit to order your book, but I'll do that a little bit later on. For now, it is time to move on to Professor Roos, who will tell us a little bit more from her point of view as to what the book entails.
Thank you so much, Gepe. And I want to start by saying thank you so much, Norman, for your guidance as the main editor of the book, because you can imagine so many decisions that needs to be taken, as well as sometimes conflicting information that helps us with somebody like Norman who can give direction. And you did it in such a human and accessible way that it was really a privilege for me to work so closely with you on this book. And obviously, Jace and I also come a long way, and it was so nice to be involved in this academic project, apart from being friends. I want to add a little bit in terms of what makes this book distinctive. And for me, a distinctive element of this publication is how the authors interrogate conventional frameworks and emphasizing the importance of epistemic justice and inclusive knowledge production. And obviously, this is very important if we want to level the playing field. This emphasis expands community psychologists' capacity to grapple with histories of exclusion, marginalization, and inequality. The collection also benefits from its diversity of its scholarship, of its authorship specifically, because we invited contributors from established authorities, presented alongside those of newer voices, because we wanted to ensure that there's a continuity of experience. And since I'm very interested in intergenerational relationships, that was also a way for us to introduce new perspectives with the old, new voices with the old. So this intentional inclusion demonstrates the intellectual vitality of community psychology at multiple levels of scholarly engagement. Another unique aspect of this book is its interdisciplinarity, and the list of names that Norman just read represents insights from psychology, sociology, education, gerontology, environmental studies, and public health. This approach challenges narrow disciplinary boundaries. And I think that is what attracts me most to community psychology, is that it extends the boundaries of very monodisciplines and how we can make a contribution to complex social phenomena by looking at it from different perspectives. So we provide a fuller perspective or a fuller account of the complexity that community psychologists face in theory and in practice. This contribution is not limited to conceptual debates. In each of the chapters of the book, you will see that it's grounded in case studies and a critical reflection on practice. So we intentionally included research. And this integration demonstrates how community psychology operates in real-world contexts and how theory and method can be mobilized to support collective well-being and social justice. The target audience of this book consists of scholars and researchers across the social sciences who are engaged in questions of social transformation. It will also be relevant to policymakers and practitioners who rely on scholarly work to inform interventions in community-based settings. Ultimately, this volume challenges us to return to the core principles of community psychology, to work collaboratively, to honor diversity, to empower marginalized voices, and to pursue social justice in every sphere of engagement. So that's all from my side at this stage. Thank you so much, Jeppe.
Thank you, Professor Roos, for that brief introduction and your giving us your perspective on the book and its focus areas and its intended target audience. Ladies and gentlemen, you're more than welcome to start posting your questions. You hear more or less what we're talking about, and if you'd like us to explore one of the themes a little bit more, you're more than welcome to do so. Now, let's jump to the third editor of this book, and it is, of course, Professor Pillay. Professor, thank you so much for being here with us. We look forward to your contribution as well.
I'm going to say good day because I know there's people in different time zones. So I'm glad to be here today to share some ideas or thoughts around the book, but also to talk more specifically about Section 4. But I think also before I start, I also want to acknowledge my fellow editors, and Norman Duncan has been very, very instrumental in leading this process. So thank you, Norman, for what we see in front of us. And he really pushed. And I think we took advantage of the fact that you went on retirement thinking that you will have time, but he pushed us along. I know when Norman first called me, I was very doubtful because of my workload. And I said, Norman, I don't know, but you can't say no to Norman, especially when Vera comes in and calls you too. You definitely can't say no. And I'm so glad that I did that. So thank you for, Norman, thank you, Vera, that we really made this work. In terms of the book itself, I think my colleagues have touched on some critical issues with the differences in terms of the book itself in comparison to the first edition. And I think when we first met and we spoke about the book, our ideas were that it needs to focus on particular things. Whilst we look at local issues, we need to have some kind of global context. And also in terms of ethical issues and research, these should be the kind of prominent features in the book itself. And we also wanted to attract a global kind of audience. When the first edition came out, my own students couldn't even get the book because it was selling so fast. And most universities actually prescribed it. But I think when we met, we said we just don't want it to be a book for students and universities. We want it to be for researchers and activists and people who are engaged in community service because we want to see that happening. We want to see psychology making a difference in the local communities and dealing with issues on the ground. And that is why you'll see many of the things that's written in the different chapters focus on local issues, for example, youth unemployment, violence in society, poverty. These are the kind of common experiences that we have in our society, but also worldwide as well. But quickly going on to the section on teaching and learning itself, there's 3 chapters in that particular book section. And the first chapter deals with teaching community psychology to university students. And basically this chapter explores the teaching of community psychology. It is very different from the first edition because it looks at very well-grounded principles in terms of teaching community psychology, more relevant one in terms of local context and global issues. And in this chapter, the focus is on principles related to the sense of community, active citizen involvement, empowerment, social justice, diversity, and interdiscipline collaboration. So those things are actually pivoted in the book itself and in the chapter itself as well. When I say the book itself, because many of these issues that you see have a trend to run across the chapters and the book as a whole. And basically the chapter is written to benefit psychology students, and also we look at issues relating to classroom teaching, and as Norman mentioned earlier, that we were looking at global classrooms in that sense, and in terms of online teaching and so on. So with regard to there's a lot of focus in terms of the challenges that are facing the communities today, and some of these are touched in the book, and I'm not going to go into them, but just to give you an idea that we look at the culture and ecological context, we look at stakeholder collaborations, practical training for psychologists, research in community psychology, ethics in community psychology, and the decolonial curriculum that we need to be looking at all our universities. So basically that's the chapter that focuses on teaching and learning. And then the next chapter deals with, is by Christie and Odwa, and they focus quite a bit in terms of experiential learning. And what they argue in this chapter is that the experiences of the students, based on their own backgrounds, their own culture, their own ethnic situations, and how does it impact with them as being students at a university? And especially when going to universities that may not necessarily fit into their frame of reference. And the argument basically is that the institutions need to take into consideration these different experiences. And that is why we're looking at saying, how do we do these things differently? So they give a very good argument in this chapter as well as to why this needs to happen and how this needs to happen. And pointing out that the universities cannot operate as a island on its own. They need to take into consideration the diversity of the students that are there and their experiences. And that leads us then to the last chapter by Tanya, Brett, and Bolidi. And their particular focus was in terms of looking at research and activating research. And if I was to sum up what they do in that chapter, is that they strongly argue that participatory action research is vital in community psychology. And there again, it links up with what we're saying with regard to experiential learning, and then also they focus in terms of research, and they talk a lot about technology and the new digital space. But I think they end up the chapter arguing that even in the technology and in the advancement of technology, collectiveness is vital in terms of a community, a sense of community. So that's basically what they do. If I was to bring these chapters together and also look at the book and all the different chapters, what will really stick out for all of us is the whole focus in terms of decolonization and how that's impacting the curriculum and in everyday practice of psychologists. We also look at in terms of the principles related to oppression, discrimination, and of course, everything centers around community, and we look at ethics around that. And I think what we actually do in the book itself is when we bring in the global perspective, we focus in terms of, and you look at the activities and the case studies that are in the chapters, they provide an opportunity for global interaction and for a global audience in terms of dealing with issues. And the online classes and the virtual classroom is some of the things that are quite strong in the book itself. So I think the book really deals very nicely with this whole issue or the slogan, think locally, think globally and act locally. So that's exactly what we do in this book. Thank you. I will stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Prof Pillay. That's a very interesting contribution. I thank you for it. Let me just, whilst I have you and I have the floor, I wanted to ask Prof Duncan about the decolonial turn addressed in chapter 3 of the book. It's mentioned specifically later, I think, in chapter 6, and now we hear also a little bit later. But before we get to you, Professor, Prof Roos, let's start here. I want you to talk a little bit about the case studies that you have in the book and how these case studies offer a bit of a transferability. You know, you would hope that once you analyze a case study, you would be able to transfer that knowledge back to your own situation. How does that play out on the case studies that you have in the book?
Thank you, Gepe, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to emphasize the research component of this book, because in every chapter we tried to include new research to demonstrate not only the philosophical or the conceptual framework of community psychology, but also how to conduct research in a community-based setting. Because sometimes scholars struggle to produce new knowledge because they don't know what are the tools to collect the data in order to produce new knowledge. So what we have intentionally decided to do is to give this book a very strong research element, research focus. And for example, if you look at the case studies, it's a bottom-up approach where we work with the community and the community members in order to collect the data, but that should actually benefit them as well. So the case studies is, and true to the nature of qualitative research, is to develop transferable knowledge. So even though, for example, we work with older individuals in the South African context, their tenacity and resilience demonstrated in context of diversity could actually be an example of how it could manifest in different contexts where older women, particularly in this instance, have been subjected to adversity and risks, and how they manage to deal with that irrespective of the context. So that is how we try to develop the transferable knowledge from the context-specific case studies. And we also try to involve and demonstrate the rigorousness of the methodologies, because sometimes in some circles, people think that quantitative research is the only way that you can have knowledge that you can trust, or that's reliable, or that's generalizable. But I think in qualitative research, we follow a different set of criteria, and that's more aligned with a participatory approach, where you can then involve the people who are being affected with this topic that you are investigating in getting their input, but also then use that information and make a scholarly contribution.
I love the idea of, starting the conversation, but more so the thought process. You know, you trigger almost a conceptual map in the minds of the reader, either through your methodology or broad methodological approach. If it is interpretivistic, then, it's an understanding this situation, and then immediately your thoughts jump to how that would apply to my situation. It's a wonderful unleashing of new thought. It's beautiful.
Yeah, that's the idea, is that it's not context specific, and that's why we also included a very critical approach to what we have produced as new knowledge, and also ways that you can apply that into the field of community psychology. So it's this interplay of the conceptual, the theory, and the praxis, and how that informs theory again.
Wonderful. Now, another theme addressed in the book, as I've mentioned, Prof. Norman, it's the decolonialization, the decolonial turn, and it seems as if that's a theme that reoccurs through different chapters in the book.
Yes, I think most of the contributors focus on that because it has become increasingly topical, it's become increasingly urgent, but that doesn't mean that it had not been something that was considered by some community psychologists for over many decades already. You will notice if you look at the principles of community psychology that it in fact is a site where a decolonial process can happen. I mean, we acknowledge the importance of alternative views of how the world works. Look at the knowledge that's produced in contexts other than those that are powerful. In other words, contexts other than the global north. We valorize and value those knowledges. So it was only obvious then that that many of the contributors would focus on that. It's not something that we had explicitly asked people to look at, but that emerged when we were writing the introduction, that we realized that, in fact, every single contributor had made mention of that. And I suppose it's appropriate because we need to look at issues of decolonization, but it's also an indication that that is top of mind for people. It's something that we would want to focus on when engaging with co-researchers or when engaging with students.
And it feels as if, that's in the second edition, there is a stronger focus on the global perspectives. And even in decolonization, it's a global hot topic. I think in even our contemporary history, it's almost resurfacing, and questions about power play in the world, it even plays out here.
Absolutely. As far as the global context is concerned, I mean, and I think the decision by the co-editors to focus on global issues, or at least to look at the global context, is important, because increasingly we realize that while community psychology has to focus on the year and the local context, it has to acknowledge that many of these problems of poverty, problems of the influence of, for argument's sake, technology on people's lives, these might be expressed in a local context, but they are linked to a global, they are as a result of global trends, global practices. So what happens elsewhere in the world, given that the world is shrinking to a certain extent due to technology and the influence of capital, that impacts on people in different contexts. So we cannot only look at the local, we have to look at it within a context of the globe.
Prof. Duncan, thank you so much. Prof. Pillay, before we move on all the way to Vancouver, you've mentioned the teaching of psychology and how this edition contributes to the teaching of psychology. I'm curious as to how this edition, deals with the basics as it is now. I wouldn't say the basics, but the current situation that you need to teach, but also in how it elicits new problem statements, new ideas that would encourage people to contribute to the body of knowledge. And perhaps give you a few ideas about the third edition when it comes out. How did you experience that interplay?
Okay, the third edition, no comment right now. So, but I think when you talk about the teaching part and the research part, it links up to what Norman has said. When we gave the kind of directions to the authors in terms of what we wanted to see in the book, we did not even say to them that we want you to focus on decolonization. And as we begin to review those chapters, then only we actually found virtually every single author brought that on board. Now, to me, that was very, very important, because I'm also on the psychology board of the HPCSA. And one of the things that we do look for when we go into the audits of the programs at universities, looking at the kind of reference material that they use. And obviously, we always found that they're using material from the West or from the Eurocentric point of view. And we were saying, okay, what are you bringing from an African context? And I think the whole issue then in terms of decolonization, right, brings this out. So in terms of the teaching question that you asked, we also want to see what is the content that you teach and how do you teach that? And more importantly, from the book perspective, we focus particularly in terms of community empowerment and encouraging a sense of community, a sense of togetherness. And the focus then in terms of the book and the teaching is to say that what is it that we do, and now you'll see that the buzz thing is that most universities are saying, in terms of the KPIs and so on, societal impact. But we've been saying that a long time ago, in terms of our first book, but I think we make that more concrete in this book, to say that in terms of societal impact, that's exactly what we want to see. So even in terms of your teaching programs, right, we just don't want to see the theory. As Vera has indicated, we want to see the practice. And more and more we are encouraging that. So the book will actually tell you, and it challenges our academics, our teachers, to say that, okay, you give the theory, but more so, put your students into the field in terms of practice. So the principles that we talk about in this book and the teaching chapter specifically is based on actual involvement in the field itself, that they are out there and they need to know exactly what are the principles they need to adopt and also maintain whilst they are doing while they're studying, while they're doing research, and whilst they are doing the ethical part as well. So our teaching is geared in that sense in terms of being more practical and more community oriented.
And not only the focus on that, but the fact that there are so many different authors and many contributors to this text, that's just a further enrichment of the different topics and the different focal areas and the groundedness of the work in your community. Speaking of that, let us fly all the way to Vancouver now. We have Dr. Jeffrey Yen here with us. He's actually from the University of Guelph in Canada, and we are keeping him awake because here where we are in South Africa, we say good morning, but we have to say something else to you, Dr. Yen. Dr. Jeffrey, thank you so much for being here with us. Please give us a presentation that'll give us a better understanding of your contribution to community psychology.
Okay. I'm just sharing my screen here. Okay, can you all see that slide?
Yes, 100%. Thank you, Doctor.
Great. So firstly, I want to thank Norman and the co-editors, as well as Richard van Rensburg, and all of the contributors really for such a scholarly and a timely update of the book. Thank you also to Norman for the invitation to this book launch. So even though I can't be there physically, it really is such a privilege to speak to you all. As GP mentioned, I'm in Canada at the moment. It's now 1:40 in the morning. So I'm going to try and keep this as coherent as possible. So I was asked to speak specifically to community in South Africa. But I think rather than talk about too much about my own chapter, I wanted to speak more broadly about the importance of historical thinking for community psychologists. So, I think the editors have already pointed to so many of the important themes and a sort of critical perspective on community psychology. And I want to, speak to how history can help us to do this too. So now I teach history and philosophy of psychology to students in our PhD program here. I'm in the applied social psychology program. But I fell into history of psychology quite by accident when I was a young lecturer at Rhodes University in 2004, and Clifford van Orman and Desmond Painter asked me to contribute a chapter. So needless to say, when I started, I didn't really know what I was doing. Most psychologists don't do history of psychology. But as I began to research and write the chapter, I began to appreciate how the study of psychology's past is more than just sort of chronicling its progress or its achievements and its failures, but it's actually crucial to understanding the nature of psychology and its place in society. So history of psychology allows us to ask the question, what kind of a thing is psychology? So hopefully this will become apparent why this is important. And I'll put this quote here by the historian Roger Smith, who says, "We need to put ways of thought back into the historical context in which the particular human dimension they describe emerged as an object of knowledge. If we do not understand these contexts, we do not understand ourselves." So in many ways, looking at the history of psychology is really about making it strange again. to ask what kind of way of looking at human beings is psychology? So there's several reasons why historical thinking is important. I'll try and go through them really quickly. And the first is really because of this problem of what historians call ahistoricism. So historians argue that really we're living in an age of ahistoricism where we have a general ignorance and neglect of the past, an assumption that history is irrelevant to the present, a sense that history is over, that we've actually got no part to play in it. And as a result, we don't have a good sense of the way that the past has shaped the present. So what this leads to is a sort of naturalization of the present. So a feeling that things have always been this way, that the world has always been like this, and so will always continue to be this way. Ahistoricism is also evident in this sort of focus on novelty, on self-reinvention, and really no doubt spurred on by several things in this particular historical moment. We can think of selfhood under neoliberalism. Maybe we can also think about this sort of techno-optimism that goes along with what people have called the digital revolution. So there's also ahistoricism in psychology. So historically, for many reasons, psychology's pursued a self-identity as a natural science, so like chemistry, like physics. And so it assumes that its discoveries are universal and timeless, and maybe more so here in North America than in South Africa, but still the case. There's also preoccupation with fads or new technologies, whether it's a new field or a new tool or a new assessment instrument. There's a preoccupation with that in psychology. And when histories are told of how psychology developed, it usually focuses on what are called great men histories. So narratives of like lone geniuses like Wilhelm Wundt or Freud that really overlook the collaborative nature of knowledge production. So the role of other people, the role of teams, the role of institutions, the role of participants, and the role of culture in how knowledge is produced in psychology. At the end of the day, what it really leads to is a misrecognition of psychology as merely a body of knowledge or a set of theories, rather than the way that psychology is sort of entwined with institutions, with our practices, and with power. So in contrast to this, historical scholarship, which has now become a big interest of mine, can really help us see three things or three truths about psychology. And the first is the reflexivity of psychology, so what historians call reflexivity. And that is referring to this reciprocal relationship between psychology and society. So you'll see from my chapter and from a lot of historical work how historically psychology hasn't come up with ideas and concepts and theories in a vacuum. That really it's drawn its ideas and its concepts from culturally prevalent preoccupations in society. So, concepts like intelligence, like community, like empowerment, so those two I talk about in my chapter, are already in use in society when psychologists turn their attention to them. Conversely, when psychologists turn their attention to certain things, they do research, these concepts go out into society and they start to change society. They start to change the way that people think about themselves. So historians of psychologists sort of refer to it in this way. They say that psychologists are not outside of the things that they study, and nor are they external objective observers of the human psyche, but active participants in the collective psychological life of the societies in which they and cultures in which they are embedded. So it's really crucial. If you appreciate this, it really allows you to appreciate a more complex ethics in psychology that goes beyond ethics codes. It's really about psychology's place in society and the kind of knowledge it produces about people. So whether it's about race or about gender or about poverty, for example. Secondly, and I'll try, I think I'm sort of on time. The second thing that historical scholarship can show is what's called the historicity of psychological concepts. So the fact that concepts are very specific to the time and the context in which they're produced, and they often will bear the marks and the sort of implications or implicit meanings of the times and the purposes in which they sort of emerged. So you can submit any psychological concept to historical analysis, trace its origins, look at the moment when it becomes an object of knowledge or an object of study, and how then it enters into the way we talk about ourselves and about other people. So we can look at things like memory, stress, intelligence, personality. So before personality, we talked about individual differences in terms of character, which was a much more morally charged sort of concept, whereas personality emerged at a time when we were looking for a more secular, amoral way to talk about differences and how that's sort of become embedded in a capitalist sort of hyper-competitive society as a concept, and how it's used and measured. And we can do the same things with community, the concept of community and empowerment, which I do in my chapter as well. Okay, so that's the second thing. The third is that historical thinking can show us the historicity of the order of the social sciences themselves. Now, that seems like a bit of a mouthful, but really what this means is that, if you look at the social sciences, we have all these disciplines: sociology, economics, political science, anthropology, and psychology. But really what historical scholarship has shown is that these disciplinary divisions, and Vera and Norman and Jace have spoken to this, these divisions don't reflect divisions in the world itself, in the human world, but really they have their roots in many respects in the epistemic requirements of industrial capitalism and European colonial expansion. So there's some fascinating history here, which I can't really go into. And I'll just go back to show you a quote from the historian Ermengarde Stahlbusch. She says that disciplines don't represent natural kinds, rather they're situated constructions of social reality geared to administer and control this reality. So we have sociology, economics, political science really emerging, and psychology as well, as part of sort of an administrative apparatus connected to European colonialism. So these are the three reasons why I think historical thinking is important, because what they allow us to do is to take a much broader perspective on the kinds of things that we do as psychologists, whether we're community psychologists or working as researchers or as practitioners. And so just to end off, why is historical thinking important for community psychology? It allows us to get a more informed understanding of the kind of science and profession that psychology is. So it attunes us to psychology's relations with society, gives us a more complex appreciation of ethics that goes beyond ethics codes. It also sensitizes us to models and methods that might reify or naturalize what are actually historically and socially mutable human characteristics and capacities, and also having a much broader sense of how history unfolded and led to the world as it is today is really crucial to efforts to decolonize psychology and psychological knowledge production. Okay, so sorry for the rush, but that's my talk for today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yen. We appreciate your contribution, and thank you for being part of this book launch. From Dr. Yen, we move to, it feels so far away. It's almost like a different country for us in South Africa, but it's not. It's all the way down to the south of South Africa, where Professor Barnes is sitting in Cape Town. Professor Brendan Barnes. He's actually from UNISA, but since UNISA is everywhere, I suppose so is Professor Barnes. Professor Barnes is attending a conference in Cape Town, but he escaped the conference a little bit to also come and talk to us. Professor Barnes, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much. And once again, thank you to the editors of the book. It's a wonderful contribution and timely contribution to thinking about the role of community psychology against the backdrop backdrop of what's happening globally as well as locally. So in keeping with the theme of local in relation to global, my chapter focuses on the issue of climate change and the role of community psychology. So we know that the world is heating at an unprecedented rate, and we know that this heating is having a massive impact on adverse weather events and other impacts on society. In fact, there are very few aspects of society, I believe, that are not impacted by the climate emergency, as some have started to call it. And of course, a warming world intersects with the majority of other social and environmental asymmetries, including poverty, including the way society is structured, including the way people move. It's also having a devastating impact, of course, on the natural world in the way in which we're starting to understand how biodiversity, for example, is impacted by climate change. A starting point for this particular chapter is that communities are at the forefront of climate resistance, of climate action. But here we need to start to really unpack what we mean by, for example, this idea of communities, as well as what they're focusing on. And of course, there's a lot of activity happening on the ground in which different forms of community are starting to take shape. These could be, for example, youth activist organizations, established environmental advocacy organizations. We've got multiple organizations starting to form solidarities around issues of climate change and so forth. Some of them are local, some have a bigger picture in mind. There's also different focal areas in the way climate action from the lens of community is starting to take shape, including those who are focusing on the natural world, the green world, those who are focusing on the impacts, for example, of climate change on development indicators, as well as, and that we often refer to as the brown agenda, and then the red agenda, which is issues of justice. And I'm going to spend some time in this talk focusing on justice. But before I do, let me just briefly reflect, and the chapter does this, on the role of community psychology and climate change. And of course, psychology as a broad discipline has focused on climate change over the past few decades, and there's a lot of activity happening at the moment. Community psychology, perhaps a little less so, but still a lot of activity that's been generated. And here I just summarize some of this. For example, as way back as 2011, there was a special section in the American Journal of Community Psychology. I was involved in a special issue in 2020 in the Journal of Community Psychology in Global Context. Locally, PIN, Psychology and Society, as well as the SAJP have had special issues. The International Handbook of Community Psychology has also done this, and there's an Italian journal in 2023 that focused on this. And I think what's really interesting is that we're also starting to see improved, or at least more people interested in critical climate psychology. And within that, we see climate justice as starting to filter through. Just earlier this week, there was a book that I co-edited with colleagues from around the world, looking at community psychology and climate justice. And the reason that justice is important really stems from, I guess, the tendency for psychology and some in community psychology to focus on individuals. Even when they say they're not, they inevitably end up focusing on individuals and tend to ignore the bigger issues, the more upstream issues around structure, systems, and capital. There's also this tendency in psychology, and some aspects more guilty than others, that sees climate impacts as universal, and therefore we're all going to suffer the same in relation to a heating world. And of course, many have criticized that impacts are not universal, particularly those who are writing from the perspective of distributive justice. And it's certainly not universal in terms of the impact it's having on the most marginalized in society, including marginalized women in the global south. Another criticism of the way in which psychology has tended to construct a response to climate change has been in relation to these top-down implementation of programs. And of course, we know that often from a community psychology and justice perspective that those do not work. And there's a real need for to start incorporating procedural justice into our work. Of course, there's almost no recognition of Indigenous and First Nation rights within some sectors of community psychology, and that also needs to change. Very importantly, and we spoke about this earlier, is decoloniality and really an absence of thinking around the colonial underpinnings of the climate emergency, and for Professor Roos, also overlooking inter and transgenerational impacts that climate change is going to have on people going forward. And this is particularly important to the mobilization among youth. So in this chapter, I try to make an argument for the role of community psychology as being commensurate and overlapping with the goals of climate justice. And in many ways, this might seem quite obvious, but I'll try to tease it out in the chapter and have identified a few areas in which the two overlap quite nicely, where the values of community psychology overlap with the values of climate justice. The first being the emphasis on collective action. The second is around solidarity, and it's really interesting to see how climate justice movements are starting to consolidate around certain issues, but also there is an emerging solidarity that's happening amongst marginalized climate activist groups around the world. Of course, social justice is right up there. There's no climate justice without social justice, and I've included an image where the activists are talking about racial justice as being important to that. A focus on systems change, not necessarily individual change. A focus on meaningful participation, where that is crucial to both sets of literatures. Of course, rights and multi-sectoral action. And of course, just to really consolidate and make sure that we are understanding that the role and values of critical community psychology and community psychology are indeed commensurate with the climate justice movement. And there's a lot of interesting examples from around the world pointing towards this. The exemplars of community psychology work coming from the US through colleague Manuel Rima. From South Africa, there's a huge amount of interest looking at all angles of the climate justice movement and so forth. And in the chapter, I give more examples of how the values overlap between community psychology and climate justice. And then because the editors rightfully wanted us to focus on empirical research as the underpinning baseline of this work, I also talk about a project that I'm involved with called the Youth for Climate Justice Project, where we are working with youth from 6 countries around the world and marginalized youth and its participatory research to try and facilitate a way of thinking about solidarity between different marginalized contexts, but also in ways in which we can facilitate sustained action, climate action. I won't give too much detail about this, but it's in the chapter, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. So thank you. That's my short presentation for this, and thank you once again for the invitation, and congratulations to the editors and everyone involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Barnes. Thank you for your contribution. From the editors, you're more than welcome to pose a few questions if you'd like. I have a question to pose to Dr. Yen and to Professor Barnes, but you're more than welcome to give me an indication. Dr. Yen, let me start with you. I see there are quite a few chapters dealing with digital communities, the digital environment. It feels as if, you know, the digital environment, digital trends are part of what we can see as our current history, contemporary history, the evolution of AI. I'm curious as to your perspective on how strong these contemporary issues in our existence play out in the study of community psychology. Give us your perspectives on a few of these contemporary issues.
Sure, that is a really difficult question. You know, there is now like a flurry of research on how digital technologies have shaped not only sort of individual psychology, but also the ways that people come together collectively, political movements, you know, groups around health. And I think, you know, I think what it originally began as, you know, something that people saw as quite useful to collective action in very positive ways. I think we, you know, have also started to see how, because these different sort of tools are in the hands of, you know, very small but powerful, you know, a small handful but very powerful sets of corporations, that it's quite, in some ways, difficult to control or to predict how these technologies affect the way that communities get together or work together. So I think it's, you know, from my perspective, I think important to be aware of how these are not neutral media necessarily. I think they do present lots of opportunities for community psychologists and for communities themselves to collaborate, to share, to mobilize, but at the same time, they're also not really neutral tools that are entirely in the control of those of us who want to promote positive change. So, yeah, I think that would be my take. But I imagine there are others here who maybe use it, who could have something more to say about it.
I suppose, you know, other people throughout history would have said they live in interesting times, but I think we do as well. And it'll be great to see a few studies emerge or more studies emerge on the digital environment, digital communities, online communities, and the effect of AI on community psychology. Professor Barnes, Dr. Yen alluded to almost an activism, a mobilization. And as you spoke, Professor Barnes, I thought how, if you'd excuse my choice of words, how heated activism is when it comes to our current environment. And from a community psychology perspective, how does that play out in our different communities? Please expand a little bit more on how heated the activism on our environment has become.
I'm assuming you meant that as a pun, the heated part, JG? It's very heated. You know, there's been a rise in activism, particularly driven by the youth, you know, through global movements. For example, the school strikes. There has been quite a lot of activity around, for example, Fridays for the Future, and massive, large-scale activism around climate change, driven by many celebrity youth, for example, Greta Thunberg and so forth, Vanessa Nakate here in Africa. But there is opportunity, I think, to work with those movements, to galvanize, to work with them, to understand what their needs are. One particular issue that comes up time and time again is against the backdrop of resistance and violence towards those groups, how mentally draining activists, the mental impact it's having on activists themselves. And there's often a need for people to come in and try and think about and think with activists how to facilitate sustained climate action. Many of the marginalized communities, for example, also find themselves being targeted, often violently, by big corporations. We have things like slap suits to silence activists. There's also a very real danger to climate and environmental activism, with murders happening constantly in local environments, around mines, around areas that are being stripped of their forest, deforestation initiatives, and where communities are resisting big corporate companies. So, all of those are very real. The issue is hot, as you say, but also I think there are particular roles that critical community psychologists can play and are playing.
Professor, it's an incredible field of study, how these communities filled with mobilization, activism, how they go about and living their lives and going through what they are going through. Prof Norman, a perspective from your side?
No, I don't have an additional perspective, but I want to make use of this opportunity to thank both Brendan and Jeff for the contributions to the book, but also for making time to be with us here today. I know that both of you are very busy, and Jeff, this is certainly a very awkward hour of the day, so we really do appreciate your contributions. Contributions to the book were great, and so too your contributions on this platform today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Duncan. And also to Dr. Yen and to Professor Barnes. We have the room is filled with professors, and you can feel the gravitas of their presence as we sit here in the room, but also online. We have Professor Kerwin Mapling here with us today, and he prepared a critical overview of the book. You'll see him, he's an active person here, he just moved about in the room. Professor Kerwin is from the appointeda Research Unit, and it's wonderful to have him here with us. Professor Kerwin, we look forward to your critical overview of the book.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone, and good day to those that are online from other parts of the world, perhaps. I want to start by just thanking the editors for the opportunity to provide the overview of the book, and a special thank you to Prof Vera and Prof Ian Rothman for inviting me to do so at this platform of the launch specifically, and also a huge congratulations to the editors on putting this together. Okay, so this has been dealt with a bit earlier by Prof Norman and some of the others, but for my tree metaphor to make sense, I have to start with the seed. And if you were to see my Google search history, you'll see there's a lot of questions about trees, and yeah, that was quite interesting to look into to try and pull this off. So let's hope it works. So community psychology has always spoken into times of upheaval, whether it's been apartheid, HIV and AIDS, poverty, just to name a few. The crises of today are more diffuse and harder to contain than perhaps in the past, if we think about the pandemic or climate collapse or climate emergency and digital alienization. So all of this splits across borders. So the book answers the urgency of a world where community itself is fragile and fractured, yet more necessary than ever. So South African psychology carries a history of complicity with colonial and apartheid institutions. It is being unsettled by calls for decolonization and for relevance to struggles beyond the clinic or beyond the hospital. The editors position community psychology as a shift from the individual to the collective, from symptoms to structures, and from silence to solidarity. To ask why now, or why this book, and why this book right now, as was also asked earlier on, is to acknowledge that waiting has consequences. So communities live with inequalities which are worsened by global crises, and the book insists that knowledge must be made in collaboration with students, researchers, activists, or else it risks being irrelevant in the face of rupture or continued crises. So other trees in the landscape. So for many years, as was said earlier, South African lecture rooms relied on a small set of core texts, the early edition being one of those for about 18 years, if we think about it from 2007 until today. So alongside it, there's also a Van Skyke volume and a Pearson one, and they have similar structures amongst the two of them. But these, the new book by Juta and by the editors here in front of us today doesn't displace it, but grows in dialogue with it, and it leans more directly into the crises and the calls for collaboration needed in the current moment. Okay, so in case you weren't familiar with the others, there's the Van Skyke and the Pearson text. They came out in 2022, where many institutions like ourselves at Northwest, I remember I was at Mafeking at the time deciding which of those two we were going to go with, and now we have another option that we're discussing today. So I also found it interesting that my Vital Source profile only had these 3 community psych books on them, but yeah. Okay, so grounding the tree, we speak to the editors. So all 3 editors are trained in psychology, but their work has grown in different directions. This is a very oversimplified way of looking at their careers, because if we think about it, we've got a SACHI chair, UNESCO chair, a former DVC, and someone that has not only developed a directory method and also trademarked it. And I think don't want to cancel myself by potentially offending the chiefs sitting in front of me, but I think there's at least 100 years of experience that put together the book, so yeah, there was no way it was not going to be excellent. So on the cover of the book, if we have a look at it, I guess let me go on this side over here, you'll see that their names are sort of written in the soil underneath the tree. So on the cover, as it says here, let me just get back to where I was. So soil is what allows the tree to take root and what carries the nutrients that feed both the trunk and the branches. So each editor brings a different texture to that soil. Their contributions mix like minerals in the ground, so it's distinct but inseparable, and this creates fertile conditions for growth. Their disciplines do not collapse into one another. They reach outward like parts of the same tree, carrying different leaves, yet drawing from the same soil. And this variety stages an argument for the interdisciplinarity that we see in the book. So it is not about protecting the borders of psychology, but about crossing them, working in dialogue with education, public health, and the social sciences, and some other disciplines that we heard about earlier. So in their hands, community psychology feels less like a bounded discipline and more like a meeting place. Their roles and experiences suggest that psychology is no longer only what happens in therapy rooms, but what unfolds in the classroom, in families, in old age homes, and in movements for justice. Okay. Has it moved on yet? No. There we go. Okay. So the tree and its roots. So every tree needs roots. Community psychology does not arrive suddenly in this edition, but it grows out of a long history, and Dr. Jeffrey Yen has told us a bit about that. So if we think about the 1965 conference in Massachusetts, that would mean that it's about formally 60 years this year, although has existed in other forms before that. So I won't go into that again, but just to maybe say that without these roots, the tree can then become an ornament which is detached from the ground that makes it alive. I think that's important for us to hold on to. Okay, if we move on to the trunk that's holding the discipline together. So the trunk gives the tree its shape and its strength, and in this book, the trunk is the structure that holds together its 17 chapters across the 4 sections. Prof. Norman has spoken about that earlier. So maybe to not go into all of this again, but to maybe just say that there is coherence despite the editors telling us in the first chapter that the idea was that you should be able to pick up any chapter of the book and be able to read it as a standalone, because there is also overlap between some of the chapters in the book. So I found that that's quite an impressive feature for there to be the coherence despite the fact that it can also be these standalone chapters. So the tree as a prescribed textbook, perhaps. There we have the 4 sections that have been touched on earlier, but I think maybe to highlight that the structure can ensure that the tree can shelter both the newcomer and the seasoned researcher. So whether you're an undergraduate student or a lecturer that wants to prescribe it, you can find value in the book and its chapters. As well as if you are a practitioner that wants to do their own independent community work. So in this sense, it is more than a book to be admired. It is a book to be lived with, taught with, and acted from. Okay, so then some branches of concern, and I think that was just trying to keep to the metaphor and also to go to Section 3, so those salient contemporary issues would be these branches of concern. So from the trunk emerges many branches, each bending towards a different urgency. Some stretch towards the digital, where new forms of community are built in online spaces. Others bend toward the climate emergency, which we just heard about, reminding us that communities cannot survive on a dying planet. Still others reach into everyday realities of inequality, gendered poverty, and racialized exclusion. So these branches do not grow in isolation, they twist around each other, reminding us that crises are never singular. Climate vulnerability is tied to poverty, digital communities are shaped by race and gender, and aging cannot be separated from intergenerational injustice. So one of the book's strengths lies in allowing these branches to remain entangled, rather than forcing them into neat categories. So to see the branches is to see community psychology as more than a specialized field. It becomes a way of attending to multiple struggles at once, recognizing that communities live at the intersection of overlapping crises, and the book refuses the comfort of single-issue answers and instead embraces complexity as the condition of our time. Okay, I guess this is a bit of a disclaimer, but in my role in what I've been tasked to do this morning, I couldn't possibly do justice to all 17 chapters. So I tried to pick out 3, and I tried to, outside of what I say here in the 3rd bullet point, that these are not the only vulnerable contributions. Each chapter adds something essential, but together these 3 can help us to see how the book moves between the structural and the social, the methodological, and reminding us that community psychology is as much about how we know as much as what we know. So outside of that, I think I also wanted to choose chapters which didn't have authors represented here today, either by the editors themselves or the others we heard about, or heard from rather, online. Okay, so to put spotlight on the first branch by chapter 6 by Prof Pillay and Lesego. So this chapter insists that poverty is not only economic but deeply human. Gendered poverty carries the scars of inequality, exclusion, and violence, and psychology cannot look away. So rehumanization here is both concept and practice, a refusal to see people as deficits, data points, or abstract cases. It means starting from dignity, care, and justice. So the chapter challenges us and psychology to ask, if our work does not restore humanity where it has been stripped away, then what are we doing? Okay. Second spotlight, chapter 9. So people experiencing houselessness. And I think for the first few times that I read this, I kept reading homelessness, even though it said houselessness. And I found that interesting. So I want to read they cite George Carlin in their chapter as to why they've gone with houselessness versus homelessness. So in case some of you are also wondering the same, I'll maybe just read this quote. I've got an idea about homelessness. Do you know what they ought to do? Change the name of it. It's not homelessness, it's houselessness. It is houses these people need. A home is an abstract idea. A home is a setting. It's a state of mind. These people need houses, physical, tangible structures. They need low-cost housing. So I found that to be very interesting and apt for the chapter, and has completely changed the way I think about homelessness and houselessness. So maybe just to also say that in centering the voices of those living without homes, this chapter reminds us that community psychology is accountable not only to subsystems, but to people who live at their edges. And then the third chapter, but Prof Jace has already spoken to us about this quite a bit at the beginning by Profs Tanya, Brett, and Huledi. Maybe just here to say that in a field which is so often rooted in face-to-face interaction, this chapter insists that community psychology must learn to move across physical and digital spaces if it is to stay relevant. Oh, sorry, I didn't move on. There we go. That's the section I just read. Okay. So sticking again to our tree metaphor, the fruits. So what the book contributes, and I've pointed out to quite a few of the fruits already in some of the previous slides, but maybe just here to say that each tree bears fruit, and this edition offers several kinds. So for students, it provides accessible entry points into community psychology, grounding them in histories while opening up urgent contemporary debates. For researchers and practitioners, it stages advanced conversations that push the field beyond its disciplinary comfort zones. The book also bears pedagogical fruit. So several chapters model ways of teaching and learning community psychology, which remind us that how we teach matters as much as what we teach. And these contributions expand the discipline's reach into classrooms, workshops, and activist spaces. It offers fruit for thinking across borders, not only geographical, but disciplinary. So whether it's education, sociology, climate science, and public health, they can all become conversation partners here, reminding us that psychology cannot live by itself alone if it is to remain relevant. Finally, the fruit of possibility. So community psychology emerges here as alive and contested, responsive to crisis, but anchored in dignity, solidarity, and justice. It is not a settled discipline, but a living one, producing knowledge that can nourish communities in moments of upheaval. Okay, the canopy. So I didn't know what that was, but it was sort of the top view of the tree. So collaboration and shelter. So above the roots, the trunk, and the branches, the canopy spreads wide. A canopy can offer shelter and shade, a place where life can gather. So in this book, the canopy is collaboration among students, researchers, practitioners, activists who bring their different knowledges into dialogue, as was intended by the editors as they tell us in chapter 1. So collaboration here is not a slogan, but a method. The editors invite us to see psychology not only as solitary expertise, but as shared practice. Knowledge is co-created in communities, in classrooms and movements, and not only in journals. The canopy also signals responsibility. So a tree's canopy provides shade and fruit not only for itself, but for others. And in the same way, community psychology is asked to open outward to protect and sustain those who are most exposed to crises. So under this canopy, the book imagines a discipline that is porous, interdisciplinary, and humane. It shows that psychology grows strongest not when it stands alone, but when it bends with and for others. And then here, where the tree still needs care, although I can already think of reasons provided by the editors, not only in the book, but in their discussions this morning as to how one could easily dispute these points. But as was said in a book review discussion last week for another book that was launched here, we can often see these as ideas for the next edition as opposed to it being a weakness of the current book. So every tree, no matter how strong, still needs tending. This edition is ambitious, wide-ranging, and deeply needed. However, there are spaces where more nurturing could help it grow further. So some chapters open urgent debates, while others remain closer to familiar ground, leaving the readers with a desire for more risk-taking. The South African context is present, but at times it feels like more of a backdrop than a sustained focus. And given our histories, inequalities, and ongoing struggles for decolonization, the book might have lingered longer on what collaboration could mean here in the soil. But with that said, we did hear from all three editors this morning that it was very much intentional, the global focus in this edition. Interdisciplinarity is a strength, yet it also raises questions. So how do we hold together psychology, education, sociology, public health, activism, without stretching the discipline so wide that it potentially risks losing its identity. The book points towards answers, but the challenge remains open, and perhaps that challenge is something that can be taken further into the third edition. Most importantly, the book invites us to act, but the pathways for action are not always clearly marked. The fruits are abundant, but how do we eat them? How do we translate them into curriculum, policy, or community change? That will depend on what we do next, which is both a question and a statement for all of us. Planting beyond this book. Oh, sorry, that wasn't showing. There we go. So a tree does not end with itself. It drops seeds, it makes shade, it changes the soil in which it grows. This book is one such tree, a marker of how far community psychology has come and a reminder of what still needs to be planted. Its strength lies in showing that community psychology is not static but alive, reaching into new terrains while holding fast to histories of struggle. It reminds us that knowledge is never private, it is made in dialogue and it is made for action. The next step is to not admire the tree from a distance, but to ask, what seeds will we carry from it into our classrooms, into our research, into our policies, into our communities, and into our struggles for justice? To plant beyond this book is to see it as a beginning, not an ending. Every seed it offers can become new growth if we choose to nurture it. The rest is up to us. Just a disclaimer, so I've used the university slides, but these are my views and they don't represent the psych department or appointeda or the Northwest University, and I have engaged with other, apologies, with other literature, although I've not put the slides on to not make it too dense. And then because it's just, I guess, poor etiquette to end with a disclaimer, I'm not going to, if it will move on, I'm not going to read the poem, but maybe just something to reflect on and to summarize the critical overview. So yeah, thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Pillay. Wonderful to hear from you. Thank you so much for your contribution. They say trees are the guardians of the forest, and this edition most certainly is a guardian when it comes to community psychology. Thank you for your contribution. You hear Professor Pillay, he's already talking about the third edition. So it's not just me, many other people are thinking of what's coming next. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have the opportunity to deal with a few questions. So if you want to pop in a question online, you're more than welcome to do so. Even those of you in the room here with us live, you're more than welcome to just raise your hand, draw my attention, and I'll give you the opportunity to pose a question. All right, so we do have an online question. Prof Barnes, I think this would apply to you, but you're more than welcome to throw it back to the editors. That's why they're here. So let's hear what they have to say as well. But Prof Barnes, I think if we can try to get you to answer this question. Tessa de Wet posed it. It reads, many collective initiatives die an early death because the collaborators are overwhelmed by this addition to their own work and survival. What motivates organizations to prioritize systemic change? So I think that last kicker is perhaps, Prof Barnes, the most important one. What motivates organizations to prioritize systemic change? Prof Barnes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult question, and I think it's something we could talk for days about. I mean, certainly from my own work and the work in community and climate psychology, we see a number of things that, could be within, I guess, within people's minds. We look at issues around climate engagement. We look at how often they've experienced distress in relation to climate change, how close that distress has been, for example, when you experience flooding and so forth. But also, I think, in terms of sort of the morality of it, how people foreground justice as opposed to, I guess, more neutral kinds of actions. So there's a lot that goes on in terms of what motivates people and what motivates organizations as a response to the climate crisis. So, that's just from my perspective. I can certainly, we can speak for days and days and days about it. And of course, there's also organizations that are specifically looking at systemic change and structural change. And again, those tend to have justice at the foreground of their thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your contribution. Any other questions? We have one here in the room.
I don't know if it will be a question, but it will be a few remarks that I would want to make when the editors would then choose to comment on those at their discretion. There's been a slogan that we were exposed to for many years. Especially it was used by people living with disabilities. Nothing about us without us. And I see the relevance in the context within which we find ourselves right now. And it also goes to the extent of dealing with the issue of decolonization more contextually, but also feeding into the contradictions that are already there in terms of how we manage self-sustaining and self-determining systems, because there's already a whole ecosystemic view in terms of how we then approach community psychology as it is then presented today. But also looking into the context within which we're saying, what do we then, do? We come into a community space, we walk away with a wealth of knowledge without necessarily, in a structured way, plowing back for the benefit of the system of inquiry. Moving from there, for me, I'm looking forward to the read, to see if there's integration here, where community psychology and community service find an integration point. From a structuring perspective, from a services rather than research inquiry and community upliftment, because the structuring within our community service is always institution-based. Matthews being placed in the middle of the Northern Cape, where they're going to render a service, community service, but within an institution of a hospital, but not necessarily, looking into the multi-layeredness of what that community really requires in terms of as a system of inquiry within which we need to be able to make an impact. And again, it will take us back into the space of saying the community projects that institutions approve, how they then also talk to the differentiation between institution-based vis-a-vis the community within which work has to be done to be able to change the ingrained elements. I've always been frustrated sitting in an office, as a very young psychologist, where I've seen a lot of people coming into the practice where I was, which was within a mining health service. And I asked my then boss to say, but with so many things happening, that what do we do to go back? And he said, Matthews, stay on your lane. Help these people respond to what but I said, but there's a community here where these people are coming from, where we've got challenges that we need to be able to intervene at a particular level. So I just wanted to make those comments and leaving it to the editors to see if they need to comment on any of those elements. Thank you.
Editors? Prof Vera, let's start with your answer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthews. I can understand the frustration that coming into a system, not all systemic layers are recognized or maybe represented. for me, that is emphasizing the importance of working from a bottom-up approach, not, like you rightfully say, doing research or working with people without considering what the end product will be or how the process will evolve, not necessarily the end product, but how it will better the community life and how the values of the community functioning will be supported and enhanced in what's being done, and not coming in from a top-down approach where people actually being exposed to systemic change without the input and without the collaboration in it. I think it speaks to the heart of how we produce knowledge, and that should always be in collaboration with and giving people their voices in terms of what they want and how they want that, and support that with expertise and external services that we can provide. So I think that, yeah, let me stop there and give my colleagues an opportunity to talk as well.
Prof Pillay?
Thank you, Matthews, for those comments. I think most of them were comments, but maybe to reflect on some of the things that you said. The opening slogan that you used was nothing about us without us. And I think the book itself actually speaks to that, to say that whatever we, even in our research, for example, when we talk about the participants, that we give the voice. So if I'm involved in research on children, so I need to be looking at child participants to be part and parcel of the process, rather than speaking on behalf of children. So that's crucial, I think, in terms of what you pointed out. The ecosystemic point that you raised, I think that's covered in basically all our chapters, to say that we need to be looking at the self-sustaining, as you indicated, and also ecosystemic perspectives. And the point that you raised in terms of the benefits to the system. So I think you will be looking at, and I will link that up also to your comment in terms of the institution versus the community. So if the institutions itself operate in isolation, and they are not doing anything relevant in terms of the communities in which they're located, sooner or later they're going to know that they're going to be obsolete, right? Just like our universities are operating right now. We are more and more beginning to focus on societal impact, saying that what we're doing in our institutions, are they making a difference in our communities? Are we adding value to the lives of the people in our communities? Are we doing something in terms of empowerment? So these are some of the crucial things that we have to do. And I think the book actually touches on that, to say that in terms of community psychology, it's all about the empowerment, it's all about human dignity, it's all about human rights, and those things need to be exercised. Your question then in terms of community psychology and community service, I think some boundaries are blurred in a sense. But I would say the difference between the two would be that in community psychology, the psychological element is quite strong, right? And then in community service, it's more about a particular service that's provided. In a community psychology perspective, it would be that it can be done in any situation, in any context, because the focus is about humanity, the focus is about the psychological and the social well-being of people. So that's more broad in a sense. It involves psychological trends, psychological assessments, and also implementations that need to come about. So in community service, it's directed to a particular focus in terms of a service. But in community psychology, it's more broad in that sense.
Thank you.
It just reminded me in terms of how we involve people to get their voices. And I think that is what motivated me in terms of the frustration that I had. How can I provide a platform or an opportunity specifically in the research on older individuals from a Setswana-speaking community, older women there, in finding a way that they can be involved in making their voices heard in topics that affects them directly. And that motivated me to develop a methodology that could be used in that regard, in that sense. So I think that also poses a challenge, maybe an opportunity for us to think innovatively in how we can get the voices of people so that we can work from a bottom-up approach and from there provide the change that's needed for systemic change.
My goodness, I'm almost worried about asking for another comment because this was so... We should include all of this in the third edition, I think. No, and talk about this a little bit more. Any other questions from the room? Editors, any closing remarks from your side before we say goodbye? Last few perspectives on the second edition from your side, Vera?
We talk about the third edition while the second one is only fresh out of the oven. It reminds me of you don't ask a woman when she's going to give birth to another child after this one. So let's just enjoy this one. So I just want to say thank you so much, Corbin, for the time and the effort that you put into critically reading the book. I thoroughly enjoyed your metaphor of the trees, and I can see how that could apply in how we can look at this book. So thank you so much for being here today, as well as giving this very important view on the book. Thanks.
All right, then before I get to Prof Duncan, Prof Pillay, a few last words from your side.
Well, listening to some of our speakers were actually authors in the book. And I'm sitting here and thinking, wow, if we could have an opportunity of getting the other authors on board as well, this would have been such a robust kind of contribution. So thanks to the authors that are here, and also to the editors, and also to you, and to people are here. It is motivating us to look at another book, but we will cross that bridge when we get there.
Thank you so much, Professor. And then Prof Duncan, a last word from your side.
Thank you. I think Vera and Jace said nearly all of it, but let me also take this opportunity to thank Professor Kerwin for his insightful and affirming comments on the book. From our side, we certainly hope that the book will be of some value to researchers, to students, to lecturers. And where it comes short, where it is not adequate, that, I mean, those be signaled for whoever wants to take on a third version of this book or another book. But, I mean, I'm taking the cue from you, Kerwin, that, yes, no book can be the last comment on any topic. There will always be weakness. In fact, something that Jeff mentioned, it's got me thinking immediately about that is potentially a problem in the book that we would need to address. But one does that through engaging with students, through engaging with colleagues, and in thinking of new ventures to undertake. So once again, I hope that the book will be of some value to our students and researchers.
Now, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, to all of you, to all who contributed, to the editors. It's wonderful to have had you here. It's time now to order the book. Act now. The book is available on the Van Skyk website, and we've placed the website, the link to the website, we've placed that in the comments, so you'll see it below. Order it now, read it, and tell us what you think. Thank you so much for your contribution and your time today. May you have a wonderful read once you get that book in your hands.